I'll just say a few things, I guess, as by way of further introduction. Here in Port Townsend, we're located in Jefferson County. That's out on the Olympic Peninsula. Port Townsend itself is a small rural coastal town, about 10,000 people who live here. And Jefferson County covers a wide swath. And further south of Port Townsend is quite rural with even fewer people. In total, the county has maybe 30,000, 35,000 people. So Dove House traditionally serves survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other crimes. Started in the 80s. And we joined the Recovery Cafe Network in 2018, in part because, well, what we were looking at for our clients was, yeah, like what further needs do they have that we haven't met? And I mean, the top one, of course, was housing, which we do housing. We have an emergency domestic violence shelter and transitional housing and things like that. But the other thing that we notice is just how all these forms of trauma intersect and overlap, right? So when someone is a survivor of domestic violence, then that often leads to homelessness because they're fleeing an unsafe housing situation, right? Or if someone is a survivor of sexual assault, that often they'll have mental health issues as a result, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and we use substances to help us cope. It is, and if how I would put it is an expected response to trauma, right? We are all very talented at surviving our lives, right? And so we're seeing all these things intersect and overlap, and yet, as our previous speakers were speaking to too, was these systems that we have created in which it's quite siloed as far as how do we access the services for these different things, right? So it's I get it. There's I think something to be said for expertise in a particular field, and it becomes difficult for someone who is navigating many different forms of trauma to try to heal from, oh, let's put you in the substance use box and you're going to go over there to your treatment agency. And oh, you also have mental health issues. Well, you're going to go to that other facility over there. Oh, you've lost your housing because domestic violence. Okay, go to the domestic violence agency. And so at any rate, our clients were having difficulty navigating that, and also building a community that was safe and healthy and supportive of making positive changes in their lives. So we found the Recovery Cafe model, as many of you probably already know, which started in Seattle in early 2000s and is spread to, I think, nearly 70 communities across North America, with the purpose of creating a drug and alcohol-free space that's beautiful, safe, and warm, and where we create a culture in which everybody experiences love, belonging, healing, the joy of contributing. Oh, I see that we're on slide now. Go ahead and go to the next one then. So the things that you see at Recovery Cafe, for those who haven't been to one before, I mean, they do look like cafes when you come in. And some of the practices, I guess I would call it, is hospitality and generosity. At least at our location, we offer free meals and coffee 4 days a week, resources to meet basic needs like Narcan, free laundry vouchers, free shower tokens at the YMCA, hygiene supplies, backpacks with first aid kits and solar phone chargers and other amenities like that. And that's often our way of engaging with folks who, as our previous panelists were speaking to, have felt harmed by institutions, are distrustful of service providers, and I get it. We like to think of ourselves as unique, as different, and to others who don't know us yet, why would they see us as any different from any of these other institutions, right? So those have been engagement tools for helping to build that trust. We offer those things to anybody who wants it without any strings attached. And this is a community that we're actively making commitments to one another in a few different roles. There's staff, of course, and that's our job to maintain the safe environment. And then we have members and volunteers, about 70 members right now, and they're making a commitment every week to join a peer recovery support group called the Recovery Circle. And then we've got about 30 volunteers who they commit their time to support the community in a variety of ways, like making food in the kitchen, helping out at the front desk, being a listening ear, a cafe companion, we call them. And then we have member leaders who we will have us, who we say, we empower peer leader roles for them to help facilitate recovery circles or other events and groups. At any rate, I'm speaking on these commitments and like some of our philosophies here because by upholding these commitments, that's how we foster the sense of belonging to community and a mutual accountability. The reason so many of us invest ourselves in these communities, though, is because we have this set of shared beliefs and values, principles, rituals, traditions. And I see in the chat there that Allison has asked Sierra to move the slides forward. If at all possible, there's some good stuff in there. I've got it pulled up here too, but okay, thank you. So how do I best speak to this? You know, we make announcements about this stuff every single day. We remind ourselves of all of the things that we share. There's a lot of different lived experiences that people have here, of course, whether that's different substance use journeys or mental health issues or whatever, right? And we're creating this culture in which we are recognizing all the gifts and strengths and talents that people have to offer and acknowledging that life is indeed difficult and we have different things from which we're recovering. But at the end of the day, there's much more that we have in common than we have in differences. And so it's this space, you know, where we're trying to communicate the message, you matter and we care about you. That is a message I think some of the folks that we serve haven't received in very many places. Let's go to the next one, if you don't mind. Some of the rituals that we engage with, as it says there, every day when we gather, we remind ourselves of these shared beliefs and values. And when we ask that question, what does Recovery Cafe mean to you? It's amazing the things that we hear. One of my favorites, somebody came in and they said, before walking into Recovery Cafe, I didn't realize that I could solve the problem of not loving myself by first loving others. And that to me just speaks a lot to like the sensibility that folks feel there. After we hear from everybody, then staff will usually step in and add some things. And it's these shared beliefs that we're trying to instill. That one, everybody deserves love and belonging. Two, meaningful belonging to a community is essential for recovery. And three, everyone is in recovery from something. And we use that language, especially that last one, really intentionally because we believe it is inclusive of all forms of recovery. We feel it's destigmatizing and non-judgmental, and it reminds us that it is not our job to fix anybody. Everybody is the expert on their own lives and their own recoveries. We are not clinicians. We are not experts here to deposit knowledge into somebody because they're deficient in some way. If only you listen to me and the advice I'm about to give you, then your life would be better. That is not at all what we're doing. Rather, our purpose is to build deep and authentic relationships. And that's how we support each other. We're working to just stop seeing ourselves as so different. We listen and we focus on the relationship building piece. Because we've asked ourselves time and again, you know, how can we help? How do we help our family, our friends, our neighbors, our community, those who are using substances? What is actually helpful? When we see people who are traumatized, we see them suffering, we see them in pain, we see them overdosing and dying. Well, I mean, I don't think we would show up for this work if we didn't believe in the capacity of people to change. But what we feel we know is that we don't motivate people by shaming them. We motivate them by loving them. So that's the answer they come back to. How can we help? We love people for who they are with no agenda in our back pocket. And we show them that love in a lot of different ways. From the aesthetic of the building, we made it beautiful. We invested a lot of time and money, frankly, into making it a beautiful space. A lot of the folks who use substances are used to the, you know, basements of a treatment agency or the church or whatever community gathering space for their meetings, you know. And so we wanted, before anyone ever said anything to you, for that message to come across just by the space itself. You matter and we care about you. But then it's also the meals that we create, with all of accounting for all dietary restrictions and preferences, the warm welcome people receive at the front desk, the caring and listening ears. And what we believe then is, by loving anybody who wants to be part of this community, then we're reflecting to them all the ways that they are worthy of that love, just for being them. And a community such as this, we feel, is one that helps us cultivate lives worth showing up for, in spite of our past traumas or current life challenges. We can all have the Recovery Cafe as our port in the storm, where we know that we'll be consistently greeted with that sense of belonging and love. So thank you for moving to the next slide. These are our guiding principles. All Recovery Cafes in the network are upholding these, and we repeat them every time we gather. We ring a gong and we share our guiding principles, and some people will speak into them, you know, which one's speaking to me today, right? But it's connect with divine love in ourselves and others, show respect, cultivate compassion, practice forgiveness, encourage growth, give back. As it suggests, these principles are what guide our community when we're confronted with challenges. You know, it's really all well and good to say, you know, we love everybody when they come in, and what does that look like when someone's really struggling? What does that look like when we're not sure if someone's using or not? And we never will unless they tell us, right? But it's not about that. It's more so about how does this place feel safe? If we feel safe, that gives us opportunities to be vulnerable enough to make the kinds of connections that we feel are vital for building a community of peer support to help us recover. So instead of saying, hey, you know, that person's shouting because they're drunk or something, or that instead we say, hey, you know, it's someone that we know. We've built this relationship with them. It's, hey, buddy, are you okay today? Let's bring the volume down to here. That'd be a good way to show respect today. And then if we do have to ask someone to leave, then we say, why don't you join us next time? And we'll talk about that. Now, there are levels of harm. There's certainly been things that we've had to deal with where it's not a simple matter of shouting. And so we have a process for, like, how do we help hold somebody lovingly accountable for coming back into our space and being in community with us. But that's not the point of today's talk. But I feel like it's really important for me to give you the context for, like, how we think about this community to then get into how we manage grief and loss in this community. So these beliefs and values and principles and rituals and traditions that I'm speaking to all become deeply internalized because we're showing up for it every single day. I feel the very existence of this model, the Recovery Cafe model, and our recovery community is the embodiment. For those of you who have seen Johan Hari, his TED Talk, you know, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Or maybe Dr. Gabor Mate, who his view of it, which would essentially reject the disease model of addiction entirely and view substance use instead as the expected response to trauma. And I would love to go into that at another time, but I want to move on to the grief and loss stuff. So let's hit the next slide. So we have all of these stated beliefs and stated values. And there's some that I think become unspoken. For example, the ones that are spoken. If you become part of our recovery community, you'll have the opportunity to experience connection and growth. You'll be cultivating for yourself a life worth being present for. The unspoken one, though, is almost this assumption that if you do those things, if you become part of this community, you won't die death of despair. Essentially, it can't happen to us, not in this community. People who are belonging to us here at Recovery Cafe cannot die from overdose or suicide or something like that. And so then when we do experience a tragic loss, it can cause us what I like to think of as some kind of a spiritual crisis, right? We always, I think it's normal and common to ask these questions after we lose someone tragically, right? What could we have done to prevent this? What did we miss? How can we stop this from happening to others we love? But the spiritual crisis, I think, goes beyond this and says, if such a loss as this can happen in our recovery community, we must be wrong about something. And this, to me, is what requires like great leadership from the staff that we have working here to help us navigate through this, right? So that we don't go down to, through despair, which to me said despair is this statement that I know it will turn out badly. I know it will be bad, but at least to us here, the future is inherently hopeful because we don't know what it will bring. It could be good, it could be bad. I want to share a brief story about a friend of ours, a friend of mine in this community who I think is emblematic of this kind of story that we're talking about. He was a counselor at the treatment agency I used to work at before coming here to Recovery Cafe. And he was a leader. He was a pillar in the recovery community. He was a counselor. He was a sponsor. Everybody knew and loved him. He was wonderful. And he died of an overdose. And those ones hit, really hard for all of us because it's like, well, gosh, if it can happen to him, what hope do the rest of us have? Some of these ideas here came a bit, at least, from an essay by a Yupik man named Harold Napoleon, who wrote an essay called Yuyuruk, The Way of the Human Being, when he was incarcerated for the murder of his son from when he was intoxicated and pled no contest. And he speaks, of course, about his community and the devastation of the Spanish flu brought by colonizers in the early 1900s, and how the impact of it was it killed so many of their people and their spiritual leaders that they were asking themselves these questions, right? If this can happen to us, we must be wrong about everything. But what he says is the antidote to that is to lean into our culture, lean into our spiritual practices. So now this is not on the same scale. I don't mean to compare it at all to the oppression and trauma experienced by Native folks. But when we're thinking about a community that has a spiritual basis, how do we help us recover from that, in addition to these other traumas that might have brought us into the community in the first place? Okay, let's go to the next one. So again, we turn to what we feel is our community's strengths. All of those cultural beliefs and values and principles, our rituals and traditions, and then what some folks have called the next stage of grief, which is to make meaning of the grief and loss. So we remind ourselves of who we are and why we're here, that though we love this person, their death does not take away from that love, or that we shared a meaningful relationship with them, or that they had a meaningful life just because of the way that it ended. I feel we've created something truly beautiful in this recovery community and our relationships with one another, and we have not ended all suffering in this world. But a couple examples of the ways that we have done this, leaning into our rituals and traditions. So before we do our meal service and we ring our gong, we have a moment of silence. We lost someone to overdose. We've lost people to suicide. And when that happens, we name that in the community for at least a week or whatever feels appropriate. Every day before our meal service, we ring the gong and we just name who we've lost. And we allow folks, dwell on whatever you'd like, but usually we will say, I'll be holding that person here and here while we have this silence. And then when we share gratitude right after that, frequently people will share what this person meant to them. We have a lot of different events and groups at our cafe, and so do all the others. One of them is a spirituality discussion group. One of the people that we lost to suicide he loved this group. He would come every time, and it was different topics related to spirituality every week. And after he died, that's what we processed. We said, today's spirituality topic is going to be grief and loss. And many people had a relationship, so they would speak about him, about how they're contending with this grief and loss. And then how do we recover as a community? And then the other thing that he really loved coming to was our monthly open mic night. Um, Dutiful. um, and and so we decided, we want to memorialize, we want to ritualize, we want to celebrate his life. What would he have liked? And he liked open mic. And so we had a memorial for him in the style of an open mic night at Recovery Cafe. Um, and so we had an opportunity for anybody who wanted to come up and share a song, a poem, a story, a memory. And it was incredibly impactful. It was really a beautiful scene. So getting to the end of this, and then I want to give plenty of time to Ronnie here. Sorry, but is to make meaning of this death and this loss. Out of loss and tragedy, how do we use our recovery community to transform the greater community around us? I think it's our part to spread these beliefs and values, principles, rituals, traditions to change the way people think about those who are in recovery, those who use substances, change the way that we behave regarding those in recovery. Stop thinking of ourselves as so different, right? And this goes from individuals to institutions. Um, I could go on and on. I'm gonna finish it there and let Ronnie have some time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. We are going to, of course, have a discussion afterwards. I'm looking forward to it. I can see that there are already some questions in the chat. Feel free to put them in the question and answer portion of your Zoom panel there. I would also say, as you hear things that you want to take away, I really appreciate you noting them in the chat because it will be great to come back to them as we get to the discussion part. Ronnie, thank you so much for being here. I'll let you have at it.
Thank you, Lori, and Brian, thank you so much. That was truly inspired and inspiring. I also want to thank and make mention of Cole and Everett for that presentation earlier, for setting the table for the rest of the day, and to really really name the posture and the potential of harm reduction organizations. And in preparing for this today, I kind of fret and struggle a little bit, because a panel is sort of it's kind of unique for me, and in some ways I have been presenting on what is the source of the grief and the unsustainability that we experience as harm reduction workers. But that's sort of like a lengthy, it's not suitable for a panel, and as well as going through harm reduction principles and things like that. And one of the sort of decision I came to was supported by the conversation with Brian. I somewhere between Seattle and Vancouver, I bought a mount for my car to be able to have a Zoom meeting with Brian and get to meet him in order to plan for this. And we didn't really do any planning. We just talked and shared our stories back and forth, which was really really meaningful to me. And by the end of that conversation, Brian helped identify that the more important thing in this day is to share our stories, and sort of gave me permission and green lights, so to speak, to share a couple of stories in this presentation, and hopefully generate some more time for discussion. So in saying that, I'm very low on slides today, and so I'm just going to be really sharing a couple of stories that I hope give a picture of what grief support looks like in Vancouver and in my community and in my sphere. Just describe myself a bit. I introduced myself earlier, but I live and work in the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is a neighborhood and community that's known. It's on, sometimes it's been known as Canada's poorest postal code zone, but also it is a place for a lot of pioneering harm reduction efforts and organizations, and one of which is supervised drug consumption space called Insight, which I've worked at in varying capacities for the past 15 years. So that's kind of my context, my area of expertise, as well as living in the community, identifying the people who access services as my neighbors. And I've raised my two daughters in this community. They're young adults now, and so when I identify as this sort of lived experience, my experience hasn't been as a professional commuting into a community or community into organizations, but as someone who walks the same streets as the people that I seek to support and serve. So I want to say something about Zero Block Society to begin with. That's an effort, a personal effort that started a few years back. It's mainly been surviving through volunteerism, primarily my own, to begin to support communities outside of Vancouver who may be more recently involved in these types of responses as the fentanyl crisis has, or the overdose crisis has increased. And so a couple of very supportive people and I formed a board in order to just sort of galvanize those opportunities. So as it says on this slide, the mission is really to support the people doing the work. And one of our mission statements is support the work and support the workers. There's an inherent unsustainability of working in perpetual crisis. And I have seen many people that I hold in high esteem, my friends and colleagues who have been incapacitated by their care for this community. And I too have experienced my own episodes of burnout and PTSD, and I think that the invisibilization of this work is something that really puts people in harm's way. There's something righteous about showing up to our workspaces, not for credit or for being known or for ambition, right? But there's also something that's unsafe about that when we can seemingly be replaced easily, or exploited, or our stories taken from us and appropriated by other people. So in some way, the effort of Zero Block is to even out that balance and to create sustainability in that. There is a Washington State connection. If you could go to the next slide, please. These are some of the programs that, and the one on the right, Folklore Magazine. It's we have the cover there is of issue 1, but we've been able to publish the 3rd issue just this week at folklorezine.com. And that is the result of a community engaged research project with a faculty member from the University of Washington named Jenna Van Draenen, who is also a friend and a board member of Zero Block Society. But prior to her position at the University of Washington, she was working with the BC Center for Substance Use and did some research in the overdose prevention site that I was managing at the time. And she wanted her submissions to also be meaningful in the community. And so we've started this periodical, this zine called Folklore, that is just aiming to bring the narratives forward of the people who are doing harm reduction work. and so there's a University of Washington connection there, as well as Malika Lamont, who many of you would know, and who had a role in this in the past in this Transforming Our Communities event. She has been very supportive and has also come on as a board member of Zero Block Society, which is currently registered only in Canada, but we're trying to figure out how to. I'm trying to figure out how. There are smarter people on my board who know how, but we're in the process of having that registered as a nonprofit in the U.S. as well. So yeah, I really appreciate that Washington connection, and that's, you know, a part of the invitation and an opportunity here. I want to mention something about Love in the Time of Fentanyl, which is a documentary that was funded through public broadcasting, the U.S. station that I'm one of the featured people in that. And that isn't specifically a program of Zero Block Society, but it's been a great vehicle to sort of the synergy with Zero Block and this film to sort of like provide a visual example of the context that I'm coming from and speaking to, has been really, really great. And Zero Block Society has a couple of functions. One is the training support and workshopping that I do with communities outside of Vancouver as they're going through their own experiences of grief, loss, and burnout. And so that happens outside of Vancouver. Another effort is these two publications. One is Folklore Zine, and the other is about to emerge. I'm going to do this corny thing and hold up a stapled copy of the draft. This is a Grief Circle guidebook, which is hopefully will be out by the end of May, and it'll be available on the Zero Block website as a resource, but also we'll be having physical copies as well available to communities if they're interested. And that emerges from a community care model, which started with a grief circle, which I'll speak more about in the storytelling. So that's sort of the programs of Zero Block Society. It's kind of close. If you can go to the next slide, please, which is also the last slide. I'm just going to leave that up as I'm telling a couple of stories. Hopefully that QR code works, because I'm not the most tech savvy person, but there is you know, just links basically to Zero Block and ways of staying in touch. I want to tell a story that's very fresh. And I mean, we talk about programs and often statistics and policy and our research findings, but we also know all too well that we're talking about people we know. And so with permission, I just want to talk about a person close to me named Mary Lou. And this is with permission in the sense that it was important to her that her story be told after she passed. Yesterday, I had one of those circumstances where I went to two memorial services that were happening at the same time. And they were both people very close to me. And I had to juggle timing to be at both. And one of them was not exactly a memorial, but it was a 1-year anniversary of their passing. And this is this friend, Mary Lou. And as we were sharing, just a small group of us, it was just really apparent how Mary Lou really kind of embodied all in one person, all of the struggle of what people with lived experience, people who have health struggles, physical and mental health, and people who are living in poverty. Mary Lou was a very larger than life personality. She was an old school punk rocker, and she was very much a community supporter. She was involved in a number of community efforts. I first met her. She was one of the staff of the overdose prevention site that is featured in that film, Love in the Time of Fentanyl. I came to know her as one of the peer staff at that site. But then over time, during the shutdowns, she initiated support for helping people apply for financial supports, and I came onto that project and was helping the volunteers in that situation. And as well, she was involved in a policing issue. There was a concern about community safety regarding a couple of police officers in the community, and there was a complaints process that I was also a part of. And over the years, her health declined. She was in chronic pain, and her mental health declined with her experiences of anxiety and isolation as her world became smaller and smaller. But she was also afraid because, that experience with with policing made her feel less safe in the community. And she also was in supported housing who were, despite her health, her failing health, were trying to evict her based on some money situation. And she had the support of a lawyer as well, advocating her, and the housing provider just was not, not interested in her health experience, but more in her financial experience. And so in one person, all of these challenges crushed in on her. And the circumstances around her death, I'm going to share with knowing that it may be difficult to hear for some, because she chose to pursue what in Canada we call the MAID program, MAID, which is Medical Assistance in Dying. And that was difficult for her, for me, for many. Yet it also changed her well-being to have an endpoint of her struggle. Her larger than life personality changed from being one of anxiety and one that needed many supports in social settings to being her true personality, being the funny and crass and in a sense, ironically, full of life. She announced her decision on Facebook by saying she has a date that is set for what I'm going to say it only to honor her. I'm uncomfortable saying it, but she called it her dead date, and which was a part of her personality. And her way of acknowledging and celebrating that was that she was going to cook hot dogs in front of the building she lived in and hand them out to everyone, and people could stop by and just say whatever they want to say. Tell her, don't do it. Tell her they love her. Tell her whatever it was they needed, which is also a funny and irreverent way to go about this, like to kind of confront the discomfort of that situation for everyone. But here's a hot dog. So I reached out to her because, just to acknowledge that, but also to say I was going to be out of town on that day. I couldn't come by for a hot dog. What I offered to her was, if she wanted to talk about it in a more quiet setting, she could come to the grief circle that I was hosting as a weekly event in the community. And she took me up on that offer. So for the 3 weeks prior to her passing, she was able to show up and specifically invite the people that were close to her to come and sit in a circle and say say the words that need to be said, say the difficult words, but also the beautiful words. And so myself and the group of us that assemble week by week, we did that last year. Yesterday was the anniversary of her passing. And so for 3 weeks, we were able to engage in that process of not understanding, of wanting different outcomes, but also of just valuing her and hearing her, but also being heard. And for me, it was a process of there weren't any words missing, and but it was also intense. And then I was also asked after her passing to host the memorial in that same space. And some of a family member and a person that she had grown up with that weren't close during her passing were able to come to that. And it was also uncomfortable, but beautiful and intense. And so holding that space, it also really marked a season where that was the first of one of these times where in the following 6 weeks she was one of 8 people who passed who were close to me at some point or another. And one was a nurse, another a social worker, sort of like those people on the other side of the desk. One was, the son of a family I knew from my hometown on the other side of Canada, who was a victim of violence, and his passing happened on the street. And it really marked a year for me and my family of struggle. And so I wanted to share Mary Lou's story as as a way of honoring and naming the people that we encounter, and also to point towards the second story I want to share is about this grief circle that I mentioned. And this has been an effort, just a really intuitive, honestly shaky effort that I put forward a number of years ago in 2016 as someone who worked in a supervised consumption space when black market fentanyl hit the streets. The numbers of overdoses in Insight changed from averaging 10 a week to 10 a day overnight. Like, it was very dramatic. And the increase in services didn't follow. It took almost 2 years for there to be a significant increase in services. And not only did the incidences of overdose increase, but obviously the incidences of death by overdose increased. And as news was accelerating of people's passing, I knew there was a gap in response. And so in the near Christmas of 2016, my daughters and I had just moved into the house we currently lived in, and we wanted to host a Christmas party. But it didn't feel exactly right because of the experience in the community. So I just decided to start that night of hospitality with a time of gathering around, lighting candles and moments of silence, and just saying some words to give people the opportunity to remember. And it became an annual thing. We've done it for 6 years. We didn't do it this past Christmas because there were some just health limitations in myself and one of my daughters. But it became something that I was nervous and hesitant to do, to something that was looked for by my friends and colleagues in the community, and which is an unexpected outcome for me. And then a year ago, in January of 2023, I was offered a space to Zero Block doesn't have like a brick and mortar space. And so I was offered a space to work out of, and there were a couple of programs that I was thinking of doing in that space, but then I decided to try to do this grief circle that I did in my home, which has limitations to how many people I can invite in. but to do it in the community. And I decided at that time to do it weekly, which seemed kind of excessive. And we've been going more or less weekly ever since. And as a community gathers around that, some want to show up weekly, some want to show up once for an event. But we've begun to learn as a community more about grief, not as professionals telling each other how we should be or feel, but as a community looking at it just for 10 minutes or so, and then providing space to reflect and to begin to understand our own individual experiences of grief, and to experience grief as not a singular event, but as something that is ever changing inside of us, and but also not to be abandoned in our experience. And so as that year has gone on, I was able to have a small grant from the University of Oregon and their Center for Parenting and Opioids. And we were able to do some knowledge gathering that's going to be published in that guidebook that I referenced, which I would, again, I am no I am no nonprofit executive whiz. So I just encourage people to stay in contact in some manner, because I really wish I could point to a link and say, use this if it's meaningful to you. But increasingly, I've been asked to share that experience, and what we've been able to evolve a bit from rooted in our collective experience of grief, but to begin to grow our community care model. Some of us have been trained in like the ear acupressure or auricular acupressure protocol, the NADA protocol, some of you may be familiar with. So we offer that before the grief circle, and we're trying to ever expand our capacity to be a community that cares for its community. Those are the stories I want to share. And I know Brian and I are both very aware of how much we like to talk and go on. And I hope there's space for people to ask questions. But I really appreciate being here, and I hope in some manner that there's some resonance there for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ronnie. And both Ronnie and Brian, thank you for really thoughtful, insightful presentations. We're inviting folks to go ahead and put questions in the Q&A box, and any takeaways as you've been listening that you want to sort of note for yourself and for the rest of us, those can go in the chat. Very meaningful. Yes, Alexi, very meaningful. We do have one question in the chat from Reva Wren right now. She notes that they are exploring faith and hope in grief, and wondered if there was any specific readings. And I'm going to open it up, or specific thoughts. And I'm going to go first to Brian, and then I'll go to Ronnie in answer to that question.
Thank you, Ronnie, for that, and thank you, Lori. Honestly, I don't have a lot. Ronnie would probably be able to better speak to this from his grief circle experience, but I'd be happy to put in the chat that essay that I talked about earlier from Harold Napoleon. That I read that thing maybe 15 years ago, and it just resonated. It's maybe 30 pages or something, but I think it has a lot to say about coping with grief in community, a spiritual based kind of community, which is what I see that we have here. As far as, doing that in group, like a group setting or something, again, Ronnie might be able to better speak to that, but Making Meaning is a wonderful one that if you hadn't already read it, I might have spoken on, but go ahead, Ronnie.
I no, those are, I appreciate those resources. I'm not super well resourced. I mean, if part of the question is, and I don't mean to constantly be self-referential, but if part of the like one of the appendixes to the grief circle is the the memorial, the ritual that I read each week, which I also wrote. It sort of came out of kind of like just, I did it intuitively from the heart in my home. And then as I was beginning to do it weekly, actually there's a story around um, um, in Tacoma when I first met Malika Lamont and Deontay Damper. I was asked to do a time, like to hold some memorial space at a film screening in Tacoma, and it really caused me to write my kind of intuitive response down and refine it a little bit, and that's been used in community spaces, in a number of community spaces in Washington State and here in British Columbia as well. And if that's a meaningful resource, I've passed that on to people, and it will be available as part of that guidebook. Um, but as far as I'm really discovering, sort of this potential, and it's kind of amazing to me how many people are asking these questions, both based around our experience of loss by overdose, but just in general, our cultural grief. People are carrying heavy weight, and so um, for me, I'm sorry I can't give more resources, but just to say that there seems to be a common looking for that resource.
Thank you. Kara McLaughlin asks, she says that she's heard many of the speakers, including both of you folks, talk about sitting in a circle, and is wondering if you have connected to the restorative transformative justice movements, either one of you. I'll start with Brian.
Yes, actually, thank you for that, Kara. Well, as I spoke a little bit to earlier, we have had tension and conflict as any family might, as any community might. And one of the things that I think is kind of unique about a domestic violence agency starting a recovery community is that we will have folks who you might call them the recipient of harm and then the author of harm, who both need a recovery community like this. And so it's always a balance of how do we make sure this a place is safe, both physically and emotionally, for doing that hard work of recovery, and giving people opportunities to change, to do something different. And so we have, in a couple instances, called on a local restorative justice practitioner because we felt, well, in one way, because we develop all these really deep, close relationships, it was almost like we were too close to it for both of them, So we had to bring in someone from outside to help folks have this conversation and process this sexual assault that had happened, and how do we move forward from this, and how does everybody heal? It's sort of pithy, but the phrase hurt people is been completely true in my experience. And at the end of the day, here at Recovery Cafe, and I think probably true globally, is everybody has experienced some forms of trauma. It always comes back down to trauma, and we can put labels on different things because it can be empowering to help us understand our experience, whether that's a mental health diagnosis or some framework of understanding, And at the end of the day, that is to me the common denominator. So how do we help folks who have been traumatized recover? And so indeed, yes, we'll bring in folks outside, like to do restorative justice sometimes.
Thank you, Brian. Ronnie?
Aside from my, informing myself, this is sort of like, I don't want to use the word naive, but it's just sort of, so far, we have used the resources of our community in our community space, and so far that has been, that has been meaningful to our group. There are tensions where there are some people who come from a recovery program. There are some people who are current substance users, where we have this intersection called Main and Hastings, which is the epicenter of the neighborhood and of this crisis, and that's where the grief circle is held, which feels like an act of defiance at times. and a struggle. And so there is that ongoing tension of bringing that and building what our community safety into our present understanding. But it's not that I or we are not open to, our increasing our capacity and knowledge, but at this point, it's been the community caring for the community as best we know.
Mhm. Thank you. I noticed that we have, a pretty good contingent both of care manager, navigator, peer support folks who are on this webinar, as well as behavioral health primary care providers and administrators. And I think one of the things that we probably could use more awareness raising on is, do you have a sense about the needs of peer support workers in times of grief and loss, that an organization who is if you're public health or you're an organization that maybe is new to the bringing peer workers into the workforce, how can those organizations, or maybe we don't know how those organizations can support them, but are there specific needs you can think of as you think about peer workers that might be things for the administrator side of the coin to be exploring in their own offices? And I'll start with Richard. I'm sorry, Brian.
All right. I guess I'll say I've been heartened to see, at least in our community here, there are so many more opportunities for peer workers and programs where peer workers are doing outreach, and we've benefited immensely from having them. Our recovery landscape is completely different here in the last 5 years than it was prior to that. And it's folks that we can call on, and they come within an hour to come sit and talk with someone and help them navigate. If they are ready to go to treatment, it's like, it has to happen like this, in order to really get somebody in. So that's been amazing. And I guess what I would say is they got to get paid, right? So I'm glad there's funding, that at least in Washington State, that there is for that, and it's got to keep happening. We were also, Laura, you and I both at another healthcare authority sponsored training workshop day, and they really emphasized the presence and value of peer workers to be at the table, and it didn't feel like it was at all performative. It felt very real, and I was just glad that effort was made, because to me it spoke to that we have to have folks with lived experience here showing up, and we better listen, So that's my 2 cents, I guess.
I want to go a little bit deeper with you, Brian. In terms of when we go through a loss in the community, does it impact peer workers in a way that we could be supportive in different ways?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, sorry, I missed that. One of the things that is probably a lot of folks here know is that our peer workers are in a really tough role here. And it's not that they've stepped into it not knowing these things, but the boundaries completely change in a lot of ways for those who have been in active use in the past and have built a community, especially in a small community like this, right? And then now they have this different peer helper role in this other person's life, and the boundaries will change, but the relationship is still there, right? And so the impact of those losses can, indeed be, there's no need to compare. This isn't the Impression Olympics, right? But it can be a deep impact on those peer workers. So, part of our community here, right, is trying to flatten the power structure, and so yes, we have folks in leadership roles, and so therefore they have more accountability and responsibility to making this place safe. And at the same time, they're invited to participate in this community in the same way as anybody else might. And so we, I guess, are trying to do it all together. We haven't had an emphasis on we have had this loss, so hey, could all the peer workers come to this other kind of support? I will say though, we do offer facilitator support meetings and recovery circles for our staff and stuff like that. So there are different levels of support that we provide. That certainly something like grief would come up.
Thank you, Brian. Ronnie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a number of thoughts actually. Things are pinging back and forth up here quite a bit. One of the things about like um peer roles and peer experience is that, we have to acknowledge that they can be quite stigmatized, right? And so for me, I've done a lot of work in peer environments for like peer programs for a number of years, and to me, the greatest success is one of those so-called peers become a colleague, right? Like they kind of, get a different job title or something like that. And to me, that feels like the objective is, and one of the principles of harm reduction and low barrier care is we heard about trust building and it's sort of breaking down those power dynamics, right? So when someone you're caring for become like, when someone who's accessing services now becomes someone who's giving services and as a colleague, that's a great success. But the inverse of that is also true, and it's true for me in that, I mentioned that I have that I'm in recovery, but I didn't come to this work as a person with lived experience. My substance misuse came as a part of my trauma and numbing from this work and so on. So then I've been in situations where I've accessed services from peer workers who were in programs that I've run, and it was honestly, I feel like it was a courageous act on my part because I was stigmatizing myself and in certain situations and saying, oh no, I have to hide my reality as opposed to reduce my risk and access those services, and all of those circumstances have been a beautiful exchange of care from those people who I've cared for, now caring for me, right? In many environments, that feels risky to say, right? Or it is a past experience, but what if it's a current experience for me, right? Does that impact my funding? Does that impact my categorization from the people hearing this, right? So the principle, though, that I think is the most important in the harm reduction principle is sort of this low barrier care, that when we are understanding our grief as individuals, as a community together, obviously that space needs to be safe. And if there are power dynamics because of someone's status as a peer worker, then the person running those programs should absent themselves in order to make that grief processing safest for those people. And we also, I feel like it's important to name that especially in Vancouver, where I am, that the bulk of the response of this ongoing public health crisis has been shouldered by this peer response, which is largely the people who are most marginalized, the most at risk, the most carrying the most historical trauma, and who are often the least paid and who are like the lowest paid in the scale, and yet they are the ones who don't have an option except to show up because it's them and their loved ones who are most at risk. So yeah, we have to pay attention to that, and we have to make space for that to that experience of grief and loss to guide all of us, So this inversion of stigma and that is like I appreciate that I'm a bit uniquely positioned, and maybe that's why being in my own nonprofit, so to speak, if I was in a bigger health authority or a larger NGO, I might not feel the liberty to speak so liberally about my experience of overriding stigma. But yeah, we need to really pay attention to that experience.
Thank you. As Dan Curtis says in the chat, that was so well said. And Dan had also mentioned that there's this overall feeling of grief community-wide, grief for the amount of people who have been lost and the lack of ways to help. And for him, being part of the solution is a way that he's healing from the grief that he's suffered. And he hopes that the growth of the peer movement can bring that up to the community level. Thank you, Dan. And then I want to also note, I know we've got another question in the Q&A, but just looking at some of the discussion that's been going on in the chat, Kara noted that she really appreciates the point that the workers are so close to the people. This is as Brian was talking, and the conflict, it can be so powerful to bring in outsiders to support. And she also noted that, Ronnie, it sounds like you've been trained by the restorative justice. So you definitely carry the flag in the way that you move in the world. And Jessica noted that she appreciates that the Jefferson County has grown so much. And I think that is as Brian was talking about, sort of how much more quick our response is to come and be present with services when somebody is ready to receive them. And for Jessica, she appreciates that because she's in a community within the recovery community where it's really hard to find those resources for herself. So thank you for those of you who have been contributing here in the chat. Everett gave us a good question. He says, much of this discussion reminds me of the early days of the AIDS epidemic and the grave number of people dying. And he wanted to know if you, Brian, and you, Ronnie, turned to all of the lessons learned by the groups like ACT UP for ways of working through grief and making system change. And I'll start with Brian on that one.
Thanks for that, Everett. I'm not familiar with ACT UP specifically, but I love the comparison between these social movements, if you will, and I'll admit it's before my time, but what I think is part of it that Ronnie was just speaking to too, right, was when we dehumanize a stigmatized and vulnerable and marginalized population, right, then we see them as not human and not worth spending any amount of resources, energy, time on trying to help and prevent from dying. This doesn't happen to me, right? So I don't need to do anything about it. It's to them, they made some bad choice, right? Really problematic stuff. And that kind of attitude, I definitely see play out for those who use substances. I want to emphasize here, this is my belief, right? But everybody uses substances, every human being, and we have in all of human recorded history, right? And whether that's, caffeine or sugar, whatever you want to call it, right? All substances have different levels of risk and they have different benefits, right? So what our invitation here at Recovery Cafe is for everybody to examine that relationship they have with substances. Is it serving me? What purpose and under what conditions am I using it? What risks are associated with it? And how do I reduce those risks if indeed there are consequences of using that I do not want in my life, right? And I think in that way, if we can see ourselves reflected in each other, then that can help change how we approach, oh, someone overdosed and died, right? Well, it's because they're using fentanyl, right? I would never do such a thing, right? We are, each of us, 1, 2, 12, maybe tragedies or crises or whatever you want to call it in our lives away from doing all those same things. I tell you what, I've asked myself many times, if those successive tragedies happened in my life, what would I do? And I would be doing all the same things that all of my friends here are doing. Of course, I just happen to have a lot of privilege and a lot of recovery capital in my life to help support and sustain what I see as my recovery. So thank you for adding that in the chat there, Cynthia, about it. And this is part of my hope of why a recovery community like this exists is, to stop seeing ourselves as so unique and different. We're all using drugs.
Thank you, Brian. Ronnie, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments and questions. In the eastern part of Canada where I'm from, for years the harm reduction funding has come through HIV and AIDS organizations as they have very much led that response with their positioning and I mean, including here in Vancouver, although That was mostly like with the original crisis, which happened in the 90s here in this community. And that was a precursor to the harm reduction services being in place. So I feel I look to the wisdom of that crisis and the people who were involved quite regularly. I appreciate and value it. And Cynthia, that comment about let me just read it. Not remaining silent um, is for me. I feel like the objective of Zero Block and sort of how we move through this is somehow we have to be okay, right? And so that was the motivation around understanding grief and community care. But now we need to be visible. And my experience has been that sharing our stories is the bridge that builds. We're all, I'm guilty. I'll speak for myself. I'm guilty, and I witness a lot of political polarization that doesn't hear. And we all have, you know, the supportive language, the policy and research language to say that harm reduction is effective, it's evidence-based. But what my experience is, what's heard more is when I share my story and or stories. And so like Folklorezine is an effort at that. The Love in the Time of Fentanyl, I I um I knew when that was being filmed that story needs to be told in some manner. I didn't know my role in that film at the time. But being visible, no longer being invisible is important, and being on top of the story of the people who do the heavy lifting in their communities for people who are suffering. And those two things, us being okay because we care for us,
Mhm.
and our stories are visible, will ideally impact the political and social change that needs to happen for this crisis to finally be over.
Thank you. I know we're coming up here on time. Brian and Ronnie, thank you so much both for thoughtful presentations, for the work that you do, for the openness to being contacted by the folks who are listening here today. Are there any last thoughts you'd like to give before we close out this piece of the program, Brian?
Just gratitude for everybody for being here. And I really appreciate the last presenters and working with Ronnie and Laurie here. I hope it's come across. I just really believe in this work that we're doing here. And I've worked in clinical model before, and bless all of you for doing that. That is really hard work. And I'm grateful to see all these different forms of support and healing across our state and across the country. And I can only hope, Ronnie, that we'll also have many more sites here with safe use, safe injection, safe supply, all those things. So it's inspiring to me, and I hope to all the other folks here too. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Ronnie?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm really grateful to be here and for the participation from, virtual encounters can sometimes be a bit excruciating for those neurodivergent among us. And so I appreciate everyone for being here and for your attentiveness and support and yeah, just thank you.
All right. Well, thank you both. And I'm going to turn it back over to the TOC team to sort of outline what happens next. Thank you both.
Thanks, Lori. So just to kind of set the stage for this afternoon before we take a break for lunch, we're going to take a 1 hour break from lunch, or for lunch. It'll be from 11:45 to 12:45. So we'll be back at 12:45, and we'll have our third panel of the day on community innovation. And that would be for in-field buprenorphine induction. We'll take a short break, only a 5-minute break, depending on how long our panel goes, and then we'll move into our last panel of the day at 2:30, which is on adolescent systems of care, including serving adolescents in the time of fentanyl. And then we'll wrap up after that panel. So I hope everybody has a great break for lunch, and we'll see everybody back here right at 12:45.